on this episode of the WildFed podcast.
You know, as foragers, we need to be gardeners. There's a responsibility there. All of us can do it, even if we don't own and hold title to any land. I mean, we can be walking through and gardening woodlands everywhere.
I want to talk about this idea of growing wildlife, which really gets me excited.
We have all these handy things like heavy equipment that with some surgical application can hold water and hold soil for thousands of years with just like a day of work. I like to say, be the beaver you wish to see in the landscape.
I think it's probably fair to say that just about every week we have less land that we can hunt, fish, or forage on.
As someone came through, there's like, you're just growing your own game park. And I was like, yeah, that's one way to look at it. I've tried things that a lot of people haven't tried. I mean, it's a lot easier than growing something in your garden where you have to keep all the weeds down and and prepare the bed and all that.
Episode 45 of the WildFed podcast, Growing Wildlife with Ben Falk, is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival's just extended its sale on all pine pollen products until September 3rd. Pine pollen is renowned for its rich profile of androgenic hormones, and in particular, it's used as an alternative to pharmaceutical testosterone replacement therapies. If you or someone you love is looking for a natural alternative to pharmaceutical hormone therapy, check out Surthrival's line of pine pollen products, as well as the rest of their supplement lineup. Right now, until the 3rd of September, the coupon code PINE20 will get you 20% off your order. WildFed is also brought to you by Earth Runners. Earth Runners have taken the ancestral sandal design known as the Huarache and updated it for the modern world. Their mission is to help you recover your connection with nature by replicating the physical and electrical experience of being barefoot. They do this by creating an electrically grounded sandal, using a conductive copper plug in the sole and a conductive lacing system. Basically, Earth Runners keep you connected to the earth the same way going barefoot does, but with the protection of a modern Vibram sole. And Earth Runners aren't like flip-flops that you have to hold onto your foot by scrunching your toes. The lacing system holds them in place so you can move effortlessly across the landscape. Whether you're hiking, foraging, fishing, or just taking a walk, Earth Runners keep you in right relationship with the earth. Check them out at earthrunners.com and use the coupon code WildFed for 10% off your order. Earth Runners. Stay grounded. Hey, if you aren't subscribed to The Subsistence, head over to wild-fed.com to sign up. The Subsistence is a newsletter I send out every 2 weeks that contains videos, links, stories, photographs, and other content that I don't post anywhere else. While you're there, check out the stickers and hats in our store. In fact, with so many hunting seasons just around the corner, grab one of our blaze orange WildFed trucker hats so you can stay safe and legal in the woods this fall. Again, that's wild-fed.com. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. Well, this is the third time I've interviewed today's guest, Ben Falk. He was on my last show, Rewild Yourself, twice, and this is his first appearance on WildFed. Ben is very well known in the permaculture community, but there's also a lot of overlap with what we do here at WildFed. Ben's primary interest is regenerative agriculture and land stewardship, which we discuss a bit about here, but he's also interested in the idea of growing wildlife, which he does through several methods you'll learn about in this interview. I got so excited about our conversation, which we recorded last week, that I had Ben out to do a property consult with me over the weekend. We looked at ways we can make our property more productive for us, but also for the wildlife that uses this landscape too. So my plan over the coming years is to make some slow but steady changes to the landscape here. I want to improve our meager sugar bush where we harvest and make our maple syrup, create habitat for many of the animals I hunt like bear, deer, and turkeys, start to access more of the wildlife that's here now like snowshoe hare and beaver, and I want to plant native, forageable trees and shrubs like chokecherries, shadbush, blueberry, black elder, and hazelnuts to name a few. Ultimately, I'd like to see how much food I can harvest here by taking what I already do as a hunter and forager and combining it with the principles of permaculture. So hopefully, as this podcast progresses, you'll be hearing about my projects as they unfold. And in the meantime, this conversation with Ben is really insightful. One of the biggest takeaways, and something we in the wild food world could really learn from the permaculture community, is how we can be agents for good on the landscape. Not just harvesters, but regenerators. What Kat Anderson calls tending the wild, or, as Ben mentions here, some are calling reverse wildcrafting. Whatever you call it, what we're talking about here is something we could better integrate into modern wild food culture. Of course, none of this is new. In fact, this is the old way. But a lot of this thinking has, along with our land-based wisdom and perceptual sensitivity, started to slip away. And now it's time to bring it back. Ben Falk, welcome to the show.
Thanks. Good to be here again, as always.
Hey, do you ever get called like a celebrity permaculturalist?
Oh, maybe not directly, but I do get people sometimes visiting for different reasons. They're like, oh, you're one of my heroes and all this stuff. And honestly, I think it's too generous because I'm really just doing what I love to do. And really, there's some real heroes out there, and I don't think I should be one of them at all. But it's such a small world still, unfortunately, that what I've done shouldn't be that much of a big deal because this should be happening everywhere. But I guess it is a big deal to some folks, but it really should not be. So many people can do just as many great things and more, wherever they are.
Because when I say your name around the farmer's market, it's like those black and white, videos from the front of the crowd at an Elvis concert where the crowd's passing out. Sometimes you make friends with people as colleagues, and sometimes you don't realize, So that's a funny way to start off. But I have noticed that the people who farm around here, they really look up to you and the work you've done. Could you? Nice. Yeah, it's cool. Could you give a little synopsis for the people listening about who you are and sort of some of the things you've done and what you're doing now?
Sure. Well, we've been working on 2 land bases in particular for the last getting on 20 years now. Doing permaculture work, but it's really just kind of regenerative living. I mean, permaculture is this kind of newfangled term for something that's not new at all. Just trying to be participants in our ecosystem in a beneficial way and improve the health of the local land base and also get a yield so we meet some of our own needs. So we're not dependent on getting those needs from somewhere else far away that we can't be responsible for or to. So yeah, we've been doing that 17 years on the first site and then getting on about 8 years on the second site at 2 different scales. And, a lot of it's just kind of like modern homesteading. And then a cross between that and small farming, particularly focused on trees and shrubs, berry crops and nut trees and fruit trees, with also a focus on medicinal crops within that. And then we also graze as well. So like silvopasture is kind of the eventual aim of our larger scale 20-acre alley planted like hedgerows of trees on contour where we graze in between. And so that's really a silvopasture system. That's the largest part of our second site. And then we just, have some
what's that mean
gardens.
On contour? I'm not familiar with that.
Yeah, that just means, on a line of equal elevations. So the plantings, a lot of folks will know what a hedgerow is. Let's say a line of trees. It doesn't, not necessarily a single line, but a general linear pattern of trees and shrubs. And we put those on these very mild swales, little ridges, and it's roughly on contour so that the water, which runs downhill, is slowed, spread, and sunk into the landscape. So we're trying to do the most with our water on site and also mitigate, flooding downstream and bank that water into the aquifer and improve the soil fertility as a result and the drought proofness of the landscape and all sorts of benefits from that. We've actually seen springs come back and or new springs form and existing springs produce better from that after years of those systems being in place.
Just because you're recharging that aquifer?
Yeah. You're just, with that little bit of structural adjustment, creating a little bit of a swale, ponds can do this too, and terraces to some extent. You're putting, every rain event and snow melt, there's way more gallons of water going into the ground than off of the surface of the land and out to the local creek and river and ultimately into the ocean. Than was the case before. So Yeah, you really start banking and topping off the aquifers, and then springs start expressing themselves. But all of that, I think, used to be pretty much how it all worked here, because there were beavers, everywhere. There were beaver impoundments. I think it was the size of Nevada in the United States alone, or North America alone. An area the size of Nevada was impounded water due to beaver activity.
Have you read Eager?
Yeah,
yet?
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
So I just had him on the show the other day. Just spoke to him, and
Oh, great.
yeah, such a cool conversation. Learning all about sort of how different this landscape was prior to I think he calls it the fur apocalypse, the mountain man era. Well, I've already gotten you off track, man, and I want to tear into this idea of banking water, but I want you to continue, because you brought up having trees on contour on one property. You were sort of talking about the difference between the two places.
Yeah, well, so the older property is more of a typical modern homestead. It's like 10 acres, and it's an old beat up hill farm with really poor soil and boulders everywhere, and high water table, like right at the surface over a lot of it, and then droughty in some areas. So that really led us to a lot of neat strategies to be able to work with that land in a productive way. That's where we originally started our rice paddy project, and a lot of the stuff that's in my book, The Resilient Farm and Homestead, is all on that property. And then our other site is just similar, same approach, but larger scale. So there's really commercial outputs to different elements. Like we have a pretty, mid-size, well, for the U.S. it's mid-size, but for most of the world, it's small scale, sea buckthorn plantation. We have hundreds of oaks that we've planted, hundreds of chestnuts. We've planted about 10,000 trees and shrubs on 20 acres of open land on that site. And so that's all part of a silvopasture system. So let's say 2 of the 20 acres have been devoted to actual plantings, and they're these on-contour hedgerows. And then there's 30 to 80 feet between them, depending on the contour, they vary, of open grassland for grazing and haymaking. And we could always fill those in too by cropping them with like vegetables or whatever else. But
who's grazing on that?
We have our neighbors' cows come here at times, North Hollow Farm. And we've also grazed. We've raised a crop of geese, and we've raised meat birds, and we might get into sheep again. So we've done a whole bunch. We also, turkeys and deer graze too. I mean, it's really a wildlife promoting planting. And so, we don't usually think of wildlife as being the grazing force on a property. Well, us modern folks don't often, but I think it has always been thought of that way for a long time anyway. Right. And they are increasingly a presence on the land, although we have very low populations of deer here. So we are trying to promote deer, which is what most people trying to grow trees are trying to do the opposite.
Right. Tell people where you are so they get a sense of where you're talking about.
Yeah, we're in central Vermont, both sites, and we're in the mountains. So we're we're really zone 4B. Climate-wise, so it's cold here. A lot of what, relatively speaking, a lot of what you can do in most of the country, species-wise, we can't grow some of the variety, and then we can grow certain species that you can't grow in the really hotter regions. But it's quite a bit colder and shorter of a season here than in even coastal or southern New England for sure.
Tell me what is it that makes the farmer's knees go weak when I talk about you? What is it you are? What is it? What are your hits that you play? What is it you're known for, and how come folks here know so much about you whenever I bring you up?
Well, I don't think what I've done is particularly unique. I think I've just chosen to communicate it in part. I mean, I don't want to sell myself short, but I think some of it's maybe been
you are growing rice in Vermont, so it's kind of a little bit unusual.
Right. Well, we've just tried things. I've tried things that a lot of people haven't tried, but it's not. That's really a lot of it. And then other people have taken some of those things and run with it. Although we weren't the first people to try rice. Certainly the Okogies down in southern Vermont, I think, still grow it at a bit of a commercial scale, and a guy in the Champlain Valley is growing it at an even larger scale. But we've tried a whole bunch of stuff, and I've spent time communicating it and making the book where people have gotten to see some of the strategies, and we've got some decent photos of it. I think that's a big part of it. And I've kind of integrated a lot of the systems. So a lot of people have focused on, let's just grow these handful of crops really well, some unusual fruits or something, and let's do this part of permaculture really well. Maybe it's a lot of times people geek out on the fruits, but maybe it's greenhouse production or climate extension. And we've kind of done a bit of all of it and trying to integrate it all as a whole system. I have a background in building design and building science a bit, so I like to bring the built part of it in.
Okay. That helps me to understand you a little bit.
Yeah, I'm more of a carpenter in some ways than a plant guy. Yeah, I'm not really sure. I think we've spent some time communicating, and maybe we're in the right place at the right time with doing some of it, but so much of it's been done, even in the modern era, all over. And certainly if you go back and looking in the bigger view, none of this is really too new.
Right.
We've done a bunch with integrating wood stoves into the systems and trying to get the most out of a wood stove, like hot water and a lot of features that people aren't often harvesting. But again, that's been done too. None of that's new, really.
I have this issue when if I travel to a place like Mexico, I'm not good with languages. I'm pretty good with accents. And so I'll say a couple of words, let's say to maybe, a server at a table, and they'll assume that I do speak Spanish because my accent will be so good. Mm-hmm. So similarly, people who follow my podcast have probably picked up on this. I have learned to speak the language of ecology well enough that I get to have conversations with people that operate at really high levels, and they'll assume that I understand all of it. And sometimes I don't. So I'm definitely getting a little out of my wheelhouse already when we start talking about permaculture, because it's not something I have a background in, but I understand the words you're using for the most part. So I get a pretty good understanding. But I'm imagining that you're around a lot of people who speak that language pretty well. So similarly, I'm just thinking, I want to go all the way back for the listener who's new to all of this. Can you start us off a little bit about what is permaculture? And then do you see yourself as a permaculturalist, or has that sort of been your starting point, or do you still kind of identify with that? And maybe you could tell us a little bit about that world, just so we understand what your approach is to growing food.
Yeah, I do. I think there's been a lot of kind of grumblings in the permaculture community over time, especially maybe lately. But I still think of myself as a permaculturist. But with the important mention that this is just kind of a new term for mostly for strategies that are ages old. And Bill Mollison and David Holmgren were very clear, who originated the term permaculture, that they got their inspiration from indigenous land use and resource management, land management systems that they've studied all over the world, especially in the South Pacific quite heavily, and in Australasia. But yeah, another modern term, even maybe more modern terms, agroecology. That is
I haven't heard that before.
Yeah, that's kind of a more scientific term for not necessarily the exact same thing, but you could make the case that they're basically very similar approaches. And permaculture itself is really just founded on three principles in particular, which is care of the earth, care of people, and then return of surplus. And the third ethic, these are the three ethics of permaculture, that you have to care for, your home, you have to care for people. And really, in order to do both of those, you have to return any excess in the system. There's no really hoarding and concentrating of resources too much, or the whole approach breaks down. But yeah, the permaculture language is really a modern take on many old ways, that's for sure.
One of the things that really interests me as a wild food person is that here where I live, I think it's probably fair to say that just about every week we have less land that we can hunt, fish, or forage on. It just keeps, while there are really incredible conservation efforts underway to open up more areas, more and more people are posting their private land here, and it goes off limits. And so it's got me thinking a lot about how do I sustain what I do, maybe having to move some of it to the land here where I live. So it gets me more and more excited about what you're doing. And I also want to say, because it's 2020 and obviously people know all the connotation there. Um, I think moving forward that it's so important that these they shouldn't be alternative, but these foodways get preserved. And I think one of them is this approach of hunting, fishing, and foraging on the landscape. I think it's really important. But then this piece that you do is, I have to admit from looking outside, maybe a lot more productive in certain regards. And so I just think they're both really important. And I really like the area where they converge. So I want to take some time today to talk about this idea of growing wildlife, which really gets me excited. But can we go back a little bit to this idea of banking water? Because you brought it up before, and this is just a really fascinating concept to me. And so I'm wondering if you could just flesh that out a little bit for people who aren't familiar with the idea.
Sure. I think in the most simple terms, when it rains, so we get 50 inches, let's say, of precipitation on this landscape a year. A lot of it actually runs off the landscape and it doesn't go into the ground. Even forests, actually convey water off of them, not nearly as much as in most agricultural fields, and not, of course, nearly as much as in a truly impervious surface. But perviousness is a gradient. So you've got asphalt, driveway or road, and a roof. Those are totally impervious. And then you have like a whole range of permeability. And everything to some extent will convey water off of it if it's steep enough and or bad enough soil and or a certain amount of water on it in a certain period of time. It'll start producing water off site that goes right into the local creek, to the local river, ultimately to the ocean. So the hydrological cycle is happening very quickly when the water is conveyed. And the whole system works best when that water, as much of that water as possible, is going into the groundwater, recharging aquifers, coming out as springs, and essentially making it to the ocean, but much more slowly, and less of it making it to the ocean, because more of it having a residence time up in the hills so they can feed the soil, feed the plants, and actually get evapotranspired back into the atmosphere without just quickly being carried off into the waterways and into the ocean. And also, as many know, when we convey water quickly, we get erosion. And erosion is like basically the opposite of our biological inheritance of having topsoil and life on Earth. In a lot of ways, erosion is the opposite of that. It's truly entropy at work, and it's undoing so many eons of life process and accumulation of organic matter above the oceans, and we're conveying it all so quickly now down into the oceans where we really can't get it back out. And of course, nutrient loading our waterways, in the process. When we keep water up on the hills and up on land, we're keeping nutrients and soil up on the landscape too, where they can actually be utilized. And nitrogen's great in your, field where you're trying to grow crops, or in the woods where you're trying to grow trees, but nitrogen is not what you really want in your rivers and lakes and oceans.
And that's a result of all that runoff carrying that nitrogen away.
Yeah. Nitrogen and phosphorus loading into waterways. Okay. Yeah, it's estimated. A typical farm spreading manure in the summer often will lose more than half of those nutrients, just into the local waterway unintentionally. They don't want to, but they only have so much manure storage. And so they got to keep putting it down. And sometimes it's right before a thunderstorm.
Yeah, right.
And, yeah.
When I hear you talking about this, it's what you just said a moment ago about like eons of topsoil accumulation. Like you could almost see humans living in their modern lifestyle as these agents of erosion. But maybe we don't always think about it that much. When we hear about the problems in the world, it doesn't rank very high, at least in what we hear. But how high does it actually rank from somebody looking at the world from your perspective? We got so many problems in the world. Is this like a very serious issue?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think soil loss, erosion, and then desertification, which is totally connected to it. I think along with like the proliferation of nuclear technology, I think are probably, if you can name two problems that are greater than all other problems, I think those would be the paramount ones.
Wow.
Because I mean, the nuclear one's a little different because it particularly could be utterly catastrophic more than anything else quickly. But the erosion problem, it just underpins so many other problems. I mean, people are making connections between the refugee crisis in Central America that are all trying to get to America, many of them, and erosion and land use because of failure, crop failure, and then desperation. There's cultural pieces, of course, as well tied in, but basically life getting more and more difficult in those regions, forcing people to flee. And that's always been underpinned by losing the principle of your bank account through which you grow food, which is soil and water management. So, yeah, I mean, it's been remarked time and time again that, soil loss is the cause of more collapses of civilization than any other single cause. And we did it here. We had the Dust Bowl, in the early part of the 1900s in the United States, and we really only got out of it not so much because of better practices, but because we kind of got beyond it, at least temporarily, with technology and the invention of modern fertilizers, and the climate got a little more tolerable for a while. But we are agents of erosion, modern humans, for sure. And I think you could say permaculture and any regenerative presence of humanity on the planet is always seeking to reverse that impact and be agents of bioaccumulation of living organic matter building up on the land surface, topsoil formation and water holding.
Wow, that's a lot there. I'm thinking about this thing I just read the other day about Chernobyl, and they were talking about what they call the elephant's foot, which is the piece of the core that's still, melting down. And, I read it, that what I read called it the most dangerous object in the earth. On the earth, they were saying 300 seconds in front of it's a lethal dose. And they've covered it with concrete now twice. And they were saying that basically every generation will have to cover it with concrete again for thousands of years, and that this concrete dome may stand longer than the pyramids of Egypt. And if I can bring it all back around to the pyramids of Egypt, we see images of Egypt today, and it's a dune desert, but this was a fertile area. It was erosion that led to the desertification there, right?
As far as I know, and I mean, they've been finding, like, paleoecologists in the last 10, 20 years have been uncovering signs that the Sahara was full of water in places and not a massive desert, or not nearly to the extent it is now. I mean, if you picture that view of Earth from space and the size of, the classic, 10 to 30 degree latitude deserts of the world, that's not a given. The lot of that tan that's not blue in that view is just the result of human activity. And, our highest calling, among maybe some others, is to turn that tan into blue and green as much as we can. I mean, that's what it would mean to improve the situation of life on Earth, is to reverse desertification and turn deserts into gardens. And permaculture has a fantastic array of literature about people doing that, and so do other fields as well. But that's the name of the game. Attached to what I was saying before, I like to say, be the beaver you wish to be in the world. Be the beaver you wish to see in the landscape, because we can do beavering work. We can be the beaver as a verb, and in the world around us, we have all these handy things like heavy equipment that, with some surgical application, can hold water and hold soil for thousands of years with just like a day of work. I
got like two questions, and you answer whatever one makes the most sense to you, because part of me wants to ask you, what are some techniques that you utilize to hold water on the landscape. But then part of me wants to ask you sort of how a person should approach the land when they come into stewardship of a piece of property at whatever state. Like, how do they approach it to begin something like what you began 2 decades ago?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think the maybe a primary approach is to observe. One of the big permaculture principles we like to communicate is observe and interact. And so it's an act of observing. We often will encourage people to, and the ideal that gets passed around is try to just watch your landscape for a year before you do anything. Now that's a little bit theoretical, because honestly, doing some things, not hopping on an excavator or a bulldozer or a tractor right off the bat, it necessarily is the way to go. But digging some holes, planting some trees, tending to some areas of the landscape can teach you a lot. So not super passive observation. I'll just mention that I didn't really learn a lot about my soil on the original site until I started planting trees. And hold on, let me just close the door here. The dogs are going nuts. And so that was a very interesting example of like a little bit of the, watch your site for a year before doing anything, a little bit of a failure of that idea. I learned so much about the soil right off the bat when I started planting trees, because I got to see the soil profile all over. And that's a very low risk activity, digging some holes, with a spade. But we like to encourage folks to not make big motions or permanent activities early on, because there's so much to take in.
Don't put the pond in.
Right, exactly. Earthworks, hold off on earthworks, digging foundations, building roads, things like that. In the beginning, if you can. Now, even if you have the help of an expert, there's so much information. I mean, it's an endless stream of information that's coming in when you get to a new site, and it's so different from season to season. So being able to watch it through all the changes of seasons, which are of course more than 4 seasons, or maybe there's 40 seasons, going on in a year or more, depending on how nuanced you want to look. It's all different from one week to the next. And so being able to really get a sense of that and maybe write your observations down, or just take note of where the sun is at different times and where the water flows are and what other patterns of wildlife moving through the site or around the site are, the soil in different places, et cetera, allows you to be most strategic in your action. And we can be of most benefit to the life systems around us if our actions are very calculated and surgical, and we get the most out of our actions, and we spend a lot of time. We spend our energy calculating what to do versus our energy just acting and then having to undo damaging actions. And be a lot more thoughtful with our action than we've tended to be, because we've just been in this free energy party. So sure, you want to put some gas in the machine to go do X, Y, and Z. It doesn't really cost very much. So it's easy to make huge motions on the landscape that people in the past, just prior to the recent era, could have taken them a year to do what we can do in 2 days. And so they had to be a lot more thoughtful about it than we need to be. We can be very rash and cause huge amounts of changes very quickly because of our access to nearly free ancient energy stores that we can just unleash in the landscape. And that can be positive, but we got to be really careful with how we apply that energy. Applying the legacy of a million-year-old plants and organic matter deposits, in the form of fossil fuel, is a pretty big responsibility.
Yeah, we've been burning through it pretty good too. So I've been here 5 years, and I'm getting to a point now where I'm realizing, like, wow, I need to figure out how to both attract and grow wildlife here, because my options to hunt in my area, I can just see, are going to continue to diminish. I don't see like a hunting renaissance coming where everybody just says like, sure, you can use my yard. Like it doesn't seem to be coming. So,
no.
So I'm getting curious about what that looks like. What, first of all, I guess define the terms growing wildlife, and then tell me about what you think is sort of possible in that realm.
Yeah. Well, I think this aspect of land management, I think, is very, very old, and it's simply the intent to reciprocate and put back and encourage, steward, and kind of parent and partner with the landscape around us, which gives us so much, to be beneficial members and encourage it to be as productive as possible, rather than just take, oh, this is cool, there's a huge flush of leeks right here, that's really handy. Well, what role can we play to encourage that, that patch of wild, of ramps or mushrooms or whatever it is, where, maybe being a part of fish, turkey, a flock of turkeys, whatever it is. So some people use the term reverse wildcrafting to talk about this, or just tending the wild, which is, the title of that famous book by M. Cat Anderson, which goes through just a lot of strategies that the Californian native peoples in the area that we now call California engaged in. But of course, this happened all over the world for many thousands of years, tending to what we think of as wild, but the people I think before us just thought of their extended garden and their extended habitat, which was everything around them. And so it's a form of light gardening, really. And it's really, I think of this part of permaculture, which some people call zone 4 permaculture, to denote not the area around your immediate habitat, but the kind of larger landscape that you interact with a little bit, but not super frequently. And the actions of that will
Are you meaning that is zone 1, in other words, where you're the most intensive?
Exactly. Yeah. So think about
your like concentric rings, kind of.
Yeah, they're not concentric usually, but yeah, they're emanations of where you're most frequently interacting with to where you're least. So in permaculture, we have zone 5, which is truly what we think of as wilderness. Like it's unmanaged. You go there just to learn, and you're not managing the system. And it's kind of what Aldo Leopold would have called like the base datum, and we're not tweaking it. But then zones 4, 3, 2, 1 are varying degrees of tweaking and touching and adjusting. Zone 1 being like, your kitchen garden, you have salad greens and herbs, and you might be in that garden twice a day, or in your greenhouse. That's certainly zone 1. And, zone 2 is often like trees and shrubs, and maybe 3 is lesser trees you have to interact with less, like let's say a black walnut you're only really interacting with once or twice a year, and then and grazing animals, depending what the animals are, livestock. And then zone 4 would be like forestry and maybe mushroom harvesting, but where you're also encouraging certain mushrooms and other species in the understory. So yeah, by growing wildlife, there's so many different ways. I mean, so many different things we mean by that. In the presentation that I mentioned to you before, called Growing Wildlife, which I gave recently, I'm just overviewing, I think it was like 11 different approaches that we're doing to promote wild populations in this area, mostly by what we're doing on the property, but we're also doing some of that off the actual parcel boundaries. Like when we find a heavy logging cut near our property, we'll go through and collect tons of acorns and walnuts from the trees we've been tending to, and other wild trees, although there's not many other wild walnuts around here. And we'll carry 2 bucket loads through the logging cut and just broadcast nuts into what is a cut over site by loggers, so that site will come back into a forest heavily composed of, or at least somewhat composed of, trees that are going to produce a really valuable wildlife crop, versus just poplar and birch and maybe red maple, or depending what that composition is going to want to come into in those areas. But oftentimes it's a lot of the earlier succession weedy trees that certainly have a role in wildlife, but we actually have a lot of that around here, and we have a lot less of the masting tree element of the system in this part of the world. So that's one light way. We graft wild apples with varying varieties of apples that hold their fruit through the winter. So
no way.
So then we have like 300, let's say, of these trees in the edges of our fields. And so then all those wild apples, instead of, not that they're going to produce a valuable yield, But we add a variety that we know is good at hanging on in the winter, a few varieties. We call them turkey apples, which is a catch-all term to mean holds fruit in the winter because we see how much turkey utilize that in this area. Fruit, anything that's held over in the winter is incredibly valuable because that's the real bottleneck in habitability in this part of the world is animals surviving the long winter. So we graft those trees. We've grafted hundreds of those over the last 5 years, and some are already producing pretty well. And we've also tended to those apples because a lot of them would just die by vole pressure. So we've vole guarded them with window screen and even given them a little urine and fertilizer to get them to come up versus if they can get competed by willow and other stuff in the area. So promoting certain manifestations.
But vole pressure, you're talking about the animal, the mammal.
Yeah, they tend to really kill a lot of apple trees in New England and all over the world.
I didn't know that. Can you talk about it?
Yeah, those little rodents will go through and girdle the tree, eating the bark and the cambium. And so then they will often kill the tree or at least knock back the main stem, and then they'll resprout. But they'll often keep these edges, these field edges I see in central Vermont are kept at a state where the apples are always trying to come back from being grazed by deer and moose, and deer and moose graze the tips, and then the voles are killing, working on the stems, and the apple root system is living, and they keep shooting up, but they're never getting to the point where they're producing any apples, or not many are. Some kind of get up there if a moose peed on it strategically one year and it just got a big jump on everything, or got protected by a hawthorn or whatever other random influences are happening. But we go through and intentionally say, hey, let's get all you apples above deer browse and protect you from the voles. And now we have hundreds of apples in this area where maybe there would be like 5 or 20 producing. Actually, there'd probably be none because they just kept getting beat on. And now we have hundreds getting above deer browse. And it's going to be an incredible turkey hunting, ambush zone. And essentially, as someone came through, there's like, you're just growing your own game park. And I was like, yeah, that's one way to look at it.
Yeah, sure. I love that idea so much. That gets me so excited.
Yeah. And, you guys have to identify those limiting factors, because wherever people are listening to this from, your limiting factors, chances are going to be different than mine. So Here, masting trees, there's almost none. There's basically beech. And then there's a few oaks here and there. Where you are, there's probably way more oaks and maybe some walnuts and maybe some other things. But for us, it's such a limiting factor. We can plant walnuts and white oaks and red oaks and a whole bunch, hickories to some extent, and just be getting at this really severe limiting factor to the ability for wildlife to survive the winter. And then in other areas, it might not be that at all. They might have tons of oak and hickory in southern New England, but the limiting factor might be water or cover or, just refuge, like space away from people, or winter cover, whatever the other limiting factors might be in that area, are the most important pieces to address. For us, I'd say winter calories is, especially fat, is pretty much, the bottleneck as far as we know from like wildlife biologists around here.
Give me a couple of more of these strategies that you guys are doing to grow wildlife, if you could. I'd love to hear some more. And obviously, these are more to mentally stimulate than I'm going to go out and copy these strategies right away. But I just interesting to hear how you're thinking about the land. Hey, we'll get right back to the show in a moment. But first, I want to tell you about our newest show sponsor, Wild Food Warehouse. Wild Food Warehouse delivers hand-harvested wild rice from Minnesota direct to your door. I've known Ben, the owner of Wild Food Warehouse, for years. He's not just delivering hand-harvested, wood-fire parched wild rice to you, but he's a forager too, so he cares about sustainability. All of the rice at Wild Food Warehouse is ethically hand-harvested from canoe in accordance with the state regulations, and all of their harvesters are paid fair wages for their rice. I go ricing in Maine every September, so I know from experience the difference between real wild rice and the paddy-grown stuff you get in stores. They call that wild rice, but in reality, it isn't. Unlike the paddy-grown stuff being sold as wild, real wild rice cooks up incredibly soft and has a great nutty flavor that'll make you wonder how it's possible you've never tried this local North American staple food. If you're interested in ethically harvested USA-sourced wild rice, check out wildfoodwarehouse.com. Price breaks start at £5, and the coupon code WildFed will get you 10% off your order. Now, back to the show.
Yeah, and I hope you do the copy, the ones that are
right.
worthy of your context. And then there probably, I'm sure, some others too that we haven't thought of because your context is different that you should do. So holding water is a big one, which is we talked a little bit about, has a lot of benefits. But one of those benefits is wildlife access to water. So everything is frozen here in the winter, and there's actually not a lot of surface water available. Depending on the time, in certain winters, things will really lock up, and it's pretty hard for animals to actually get access to water. So we've developed springs, and when we develop them, we make them in such a way where we're encouraging parts of the springs to remain open in the winter. Like we'll make like a little waterfall and make the pool deep enough where parts of it we'll try to aim for parts of it staying unfrozen. Mm-hmm. So there's always a pool, even on a -10, -20 degree stretch in late January, there's surface water access. That's a big one. We'll log, when we log for our firewood, we try to drop a lot of red maples at the right time to feed the deer just with the buds. You're dropping a buffet of canopy buds on the ground. And as I'm sure you've seen, they love, the bud. Mm-hmm. They need to access, they can't reach the canopy most of the time. So loggers can provide a ton of food for deer. And so we'll strategically drop a lot of trees and try to get a canopy down for them to graze on through the hardest parts of winter, which is also a good time to do logging for various reasons, when the ground's hard and when the sap is not up in the tree as much, so you have nice dry wood to begin with. The grafting I mentioned, the fertilization and promoting of certain masting and masting, including apple trees. We plant, just straight up planting. We plant thousands of trees. Now we're mostly planted on this second site, so we're still planting a little bit here and there, but mostly just encouraging the trees that exist, trying to get them, make sure they get above deer browse. We grow deer food plots. We'll actually straight up sow broadcast tillage radish and purple top turnips and white clover and yellow blossom clover and a bunch of other stuff for deer to utilize in the fall and sometimes early winter. They'll dig right through the snow eating turnips and radish all winter, and then manure that area. So they're actually, one of the areas we do that's in an old orchard. So they're kind of helping the old trees by getting some nutrient cycling in there. We'll promote deer winter cover, like conifer cover, and try not to go into certain areas where we know they're bedding down and cause them to have to spend more energy fleeing us. So sometimes it's not trying to not do certain things, of course, which can be the most helpful. Oftentimes we love to do things to help as humans, and so much of the time it's things we just shouldn't do to be helpful. What can I not do is really the design question. But yeah, those are some of them, and I think I have a handful of others in my presentation I did, which is on YouTube, called "Growing Wildlife" for this Thriving Farmer Summit, I think it was called.
Oh, cool. We'll put links to it in the show notes.
Sure.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Is anybody hunting on your property?
I do, and sometimes I think neighbors cruise through looking for deer. Mm-hmm. But I've been hunting deer here and turkey. Sometimes walking for upland birds, which is more like just walking for fun with a 20 gauge shotgun and never flushing birds when you're actually carrying the shotgun. But
you flush them, but you don't really even you
see
spend so much time just like being startled that you don't get to shoot.
Right. Really, I think so far I've mostly focused on just trying to grow and get the food system for the wildlife established, knowing that someday I'm going to be really asking for the wildlife in return to be on my plate, but haven't really spent a lot of time harvesting them just yet. Partly, I feel like the turkey populations are coming back and the bear are doing well here, but the deer population is quite low here for sure.
You are seeing a lot of bear out there?
Yeah, I've heard and I seem to see that the bear population is doing well. The moose,
what do they like that you're doing?
I don't know. Well, they like the bee. I keep bees, and I haven't let them in there. I've got a lot. I've got 10,000 volts around that, and a hard fence too. So that's not helping them out, which is good by me. I don't know what the bears are utilizing for us. I'm noticing some fascinating use of moose, the use of our pond by moose, and I've been letting the beavers kind of dominate our lower pond, and there's a neat synergy potentially happening between them and a young male moose that seems to be here a lot lately. And the beavers are expanding, the area of water, and now the moose are coming in. I've never seen them down at this elevation. Could be because of the drought. And so sometimes, like I said, not doing something's the best. So we haven't evicted the beaver. And I think they have a cascade of benefits in the landscape. And we're seeing that potentially with more moose activity on our bottom pond. I don't know how we're benefiting bear per se right now.
I've got a beaver bog out behind me that I'm working on purchasing. And, all the neighbors talk about like, we got to get those beaver out of there. And I'm always like, but why though? Like no one's utilized, like why though? It's just the water level's coming up. Yeah, but you don't even do anything down there. Why? And what we have is the whole area down there is torn up by moose. Like this is where they're coming to hang around this beaver bog, So I'm trying to like preserve this area by purchasing it and sort of expanding on what's going on down there. But I'm finding everything you're talking about beautiful and sort of overwhelming. Because I'm like, oh my gosh, where would I start with all this? It's so much when you're talking about hundreds of trees and all these bees. And obviously this was one step at a time that you got there. For somebody like me, and I think I've asked you this every time I've interviewed you now, but I spend so much of my time on the landscape, but in such a different way,
Right.
And it's always away from where I live, which is one of the things I'm noticing that I want to sort of integrate better, because I'm hunting constantly somewhere else. I'm fishing constantly somewhere else, and I'm foraging somewhere else all the time. So I'm like, how do I section off some of my time and energy so that I can put it in here to reap big rewards later, even if I don't get them right away? Because when I go out hunting, I'm not like one of these guys who goes out hunting for the process of hunting. I go out to get food, and that makes me very target focused. And so I approach each time kind of like maybe how like a SWAT team works something up. It's like, we're not going in there just for the walk. We go in there, we have our purpose, right? So that works great for me. I go out, I bring a ton of stuff home, but the landscape where I'm living, I'm feeling like I'm not doing what I could be doing here. So somebody like me, somebody listening, where do they get started? What's the beginning?
Well, I think the baseline maybe, and this is not certainly, I'm no expert at this. I'm just someone who's trying to participate in it. I think part of the baseline foundational approach is to look at what are the habitats and what are the conditions that are leading to manifestations of what you harvest. A flush of oyster mushrooms. Let's take that for instance. Around here they need fallen maple trees in general, or maples in a certain stage of decay, sugar maples especially. So one easy thing that I've started to do over the years is when I harvest oyster, I'll grab some of the myceliated wood chips, and on my way walking back out or wherever I'm walking next, whether it's to look for more oysters or something else, or to get out and start walking home, I'll keep an eye out for a similar state maple or suitable habitat and tuck a piece of that myceliated wood material into that log or onto it strategically so it doesn't dry out on the shady side of it, whatever it is. Tuck some leaves over it. So there you're planting the seeds of more oyster. And so there's so many ways we can do that. I mean, there's no limit.
Give me more. I love that. That's great. Can you think of more examples?
You'll think I'm excited for you. You'll think of thousands of, hundreds and hundreds of ways to do that because you're interacting with the landscape. The baseline is going out there interacting. And then just with the question in mind, how can I promote all the goodness that I'm benefiting from? So, you can do that with oyster. You can do that with a lot of different mushrooms. I'll do that with chanterelles. I'll grab up a little piece of the soil where the chanterelles are emerging from and look for, those similar kind of soft, woody edge, hardwood mosaic forests where there's the right amount of moss, where chanterelles seem to love it over here in the same aspect, and tuck them in on my way walking. Releasing old apple trees. I mean, a lot of it's if you can carry a pole saw with you, even though you don't know that you'll use it, or pruners, you can release certain species to be of benefit. Just
Define
literally
that for
finding,
people so they know what you mean.
releasing, just cutting around, allowing sunlight to fall on the plant you're trying to promote. So releasing old apples would be to go into a woods and find old apples, which are everywhere in New England, and cutting the competing growth around them to let some sun fall onto that tree, and give it a bunch of pee while you're there, and instead of peeing somewhere else, pee at the base of that tree. So you're promoting that tree, which was with just a little bit of help can all of a sudden start producing a bunch of apples instead of just barely surviving because it's being shaded out by this white pine, large sapling that's starting to take over its canopy, sunshine access. And that can be 5 minutes or 20 minutes with a pull saw or sometimes a chainsaw to just all of a sudden, or in a urination event, to all of a sudden have apples in some place in the landscape that
Why the
essentially,
urination event? That's nitrogen?
because for nitrogen, yeah. So our forests are so limited by nutrients, in large part, I think, because we have cut off the connection of the mountains to the ocean are the rivers. Those are the veins, you can think of them, and those have been cut off by dams. And so what used to bring all the nitrogen, or a lot of nitrogen, back from the ocean into the woods to come up and spawn every year and then be eaten by bear and pooped out, and all that nitrogen to return to the upland landscape, salmon and salmonid, types of fish runs, spawning runs. So that is probably a huge impact on the landscape. And people like David Suzuki have talked about that we can't grow, the old growth can't grow like it used to now because that nutrient cycle is gone. The trees now don't, in the forests and the mountains, don't have the nutrients feeding them that they used to via the salmon run. There used to be salmon. The early settlers in the history of my town here, I read about in the local history book, survived the first bunch of winters on salmon, ocean-going salmon.
In central Vermont.
And I'm way up in central Vermont at the top of the White River watershed. I cannot imagine salmon in this upland hollow valley. And they were in this water body just north of my property. And of course, there were no dams. I mean, they made it all the way up. And that was probably the highest point they got. But all that nutrients, no longer in the system. So
these weren't small fish either. When you know what I mean, like, because now you could probably go out there and you could probably catch a few little brook trout.
Sure,
and they're going to be, a big one's going to be 6 inches. It's going to be like sardines.
Right.
But the idea that you had fish that were several pounds, or maybe even bigger than that, even 10, 15 pounds. I mean, huge fish coming up there. It's just really hard to even imagine today.
And the whole cascade of benefit into the landscape around it that a species like that would serve. I mean, we scarcely can imagine what the nutrient flows and the abundance was like. I mean, what is that animated video is incredible. It's French, about the St. Lawrence, and how they never thought to even take fish out of the river itself, because you could just pick one off the side of the river, because there were so many in the salmon runs. They just line the banks like feet thick in places of the the whole connection between the Great Lakes watershed, the whole Great Lakes freshwater system, and the ocean, and that St. Lawrence Seaway being just overflowing with abundance, couldn't hold as many fish as needed to be in it at that time, and how that drove the terrestrial systems. But yeah, there's so many little like tweaking and like reverse wildcrafting actions we can take as we walk through the woods. And honestly, I feel like I'm at the beginning of just even doing some of it, but it's pretty endless. It's very inspiring because all of us can do it, even if we don't own and hold title to any land. I mean, we can be walking through and gardening.
That's what I want to ask you
everywhere.
about. Because let's say, okay, you gave us 2 great mushroom examples. So I'm wondering if you could give us an example with maybe a tree fruit. So let's say it could be choke cherries or black cherries or, a shad or something like that. And then maybe we could also you could give us an example of something like a forb. It could be leeks, or it could be a fern or something like that. How do we be better? Because right now, as you know, especially with I think COVID put pressure on food systems being a little bit, lacking abundance puts a lot of things in people's minds psychologically. They start thinking about food in different ways. And now the wild food culture is starting to swell a little bit. And this is exciting to me, but I want to make sure that we're helping as best we can at WildFed to funnel people towards sustainability in this regard, especially for a bunch of reasons. One, obviously, just baseline for the landscape and the animals that live there, but also because I don't want to see harsh regulations start coming quickly because people start moving out onto the landscape in a bigger way too, right? So I think that a lot of people, when we first come out of a consumer approach, a consumerism approach, we start working with the landscape. We're only seeing what we take and don't always think about how we can also contribute. So I guess like what you're saying now is such a beautiful message to the people listening and to myself. So I'll let you take it away, but I'd love some plant ideas too.
Yeah. Well, so definitely with the wild leek, ramps, we've planted them with some success. We only harvest the leaves. I take, a one leaf instead of both leaves from a plant and try to have it be, just very sporadic. And I've heard from a really good foraging friend of mine that you want to work on the, which one was it? That they tend to roll downhill, the seeds. So they tend to move downhill. So harvest on the downhill end of the patch and not the uphill end.
Oh, and bring your seeds uphill probably then.
Yeah, and if you can move the seed uphill, all the better. But we've actually transplanted some with some success. I mean, if you can find, we can just be the dispersion event we wish to see, and the plants, are happy to use our help to be transplanted 1,000 feet away where a seed wouldn't have landed, but it's a nice moist patch where they'd be very happy. And we have had some success transplanting them and mostly stewarding patches without them being denuded, although I think they can get denuded very quickly, as many are noting. I know someone in Western New York who says that they're seeing patches shrink if people harvest more than 1 in 100. And then I know people like in northern... Yeah, I know folks like, I think you just interviewed him, Clay, in Michigan, who says like, you could take way more leeks than that where he is, and like they're just super abundant. So it really varies.
That's what I hear out there by the Great Lakes. But out here, Arthur Haynes told me that in Maine we have less than, because he does the rare plant surveys. He says we have less than 100 populations here of wild leeks, and most of them are quite small. So we're doing that one leaf at a time too. And I mean, we're tiptoeing around like we're in a glass house, so afraid of doing any damage to them. Yeah, what we have here.
So I think planting those can be successful. I think they're tricky. They're not that easy, but we have had some success with moving them around and trying to increase how many nodes of them are in the landscape, and maybe trying to put some in very hidden areas where no one's gonna hopefully be able to get to them. So they'll be like seed populations, and refuges. And then in terms of other stuff, I mean, walking through the woods and like planting apple trees in clearings is very easy. And that can be done very quickly with bare root apple trees that are 2 feet, little whips that are 2 feet tall. You can grow them from seed yourself for free, or you can
How long do they take to get to that size?
A couple years to get to 2 feet. You can just grow them in seeds like you would in a garden. I mean, literally grow a garden bed of trees. Like a lot of people don't realize that how nursery men and women do it. It's like you literally in a garden bed can grow like 100 trees, just like you're growing vegetables, and they're easier to grow than vegetables. So it's really easy to
pulling them up to,
and then just dig. You lift them, dig them when they're dormant in November, put them in a root cellar and plant them in April, or dig them in April and just retransplant them to the larger landscape. So you have a little piece of your nursery, your garden devoted to enhancing the quote unquote wild larger landscape around you. Very, very easy to do, but it just takes remembering to do it and trying to do it. Trying to think of we promote a lot of milkweed just for the monarchs. It's not obviously anything we're harvesting, but I'm looking at massive patches of milkweed here and there now. And that's just from...
Oh, I eat a lot of it every year.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah. Of course it is a food source too. So definitely like a lot of just avoiding, mowing or grazing at certain times can lead to certain flushes and abundances. I'm trying to think. There's not a lot of other in the woods type of plantings we do. We've made some strategic fires before and sown morel spawn with some success. It hasn't been long lived, but I know in parts of the world, I once was in part of Chile where they have tons of morels, and they actively burn to promote the morel growth. And so they're growing morels, you could say, to some extent. They're gardening morel mushrooms. I think, as you know, it's so unlimited, and it takes knowing each creature, the plants and fungi and animals really well to know how can we be of benefit to them.
But it's pretty basic. What you're saying is essentially observe the species, observe the conditions that it needs, do little things to recreate those conditions.
Exactly. I think it's about the easiest thing going. I mean, it's a lot easier than growing something in your garden where you have to keep all the weeds down and prepare the bed and all that. I think in some ways it's the easiest form of gardening, and it's certainly really fun, and it's not very tool intensive, and it can involve a lot of movement because you can walk a bunch instead of just being in one place.
What kind of tools do you have on you all the time? I'm kind of curious in your lifestyle.
Well, all the time, not so many, but I try to remember to carry my pruners with me when I'm walking around because they're
little
often
snips.
Little Felco 13s are my favorite. They're the double. They're like the double-handed, Felcos. I do maybe a few thousand pulls on those every year, so they're worth it. Getting some good ones if you're going to use them. I do a lot of pruning of my apples.
Yeah.
I have maybe 100 apple trees. I'm taking maybe 30 of them I'm taking pretty good care of. And then I prune maybe regularly the 50 plus, cider orchard and that kind of thing. A hori is really useful to have on your belt for some of this, which is a soil knife. It's a little soil knife, like those 7-inch. They look like stainless steel daggers, but they're not that sharp. They're like a soil knife.
Yeah, I know what you're talking about.
With a serrated edge. They're awesome, like a Japanese soil knife. Hori, they're a life-changing tool. If you don't have one, you wonder how you got by without one when you get one of those. We get them from A.M. Leonard. And then, a digging spade obviously is really useful, like a nice planting spade, like a steel, one piece of aluminum or steel, one piece from the blade to the handle, so it's not too.
Okay.
So it's very strong.
It's not going to come apart. Yeah.
Yeah, you can pop some rocks out if you need to. So I'll go through and plant walnuts in the woods with that, and even broadcast walnuts. One thing we did actually a few years ago is I harvested a ton of walnuts in my village, which I didn't. There were just so many, and I was just got 3 burlap bags full one morning, and I was going up to a friend's place who was 1,800 feet. It happens to be at the highest part of the town. And so I brought them with me and just spread them around his property. So then they're at the highest part of the landscape to gravity feed the local forest with, say there's 300 walnuts there. If just 10 of them live, that's thousands of walnuts to be produced in the coming decades, which will be then thousands and thousands of more trees over. They're all like these dispersion bomb events, which just ripple through the landscape, over time. So that's, another thing you can do. If you're going from one place to another, bring seed with you. Now, don't do it willy-nilly. Don't grab maybe, knotweed roots and just start driving those around. But, there's a lot of the opposite you can do from that,
Oh, man. I'm getting really inspired. Hey, how many students would you say you've had over the years come through?
I think 500 and something. I actually counted them. I tried to tally up in our permaculture course, and then we've done a bunch of short courses. So, yeah, maybe 500 to 700 total, probably maybe through in the last 10, 12 years or so.
What are the qualities that you've noticed make somebody good at this versus somebody who you kind of know right off? You're like, this person's not going to make it in this kind of field, so to speak.
I think, it's a great question. And I think increasingly every year, and I think about this a lot we have an apprenticeship every spring. And I try to always learn what is it that, when an apprentice goes on to really do something impactful and succeed in making cool stuff happen versus not that I always know, but when I hear about it, I think it's totally not dependent on the knowledge they came in with. Like I used to think, we want someone experienced in this or that. And now I really don't care about their previous experience coming in or that much, or their knowledge for sure, their information. And sometimes that's even a liability because they're used to doing certain things in certain ways. And it's really about how well they can pay attention and observe and anticipate what's going to happen in like a work situation when people are working together. They being anticipatory is big, but just basically kind of having an eye to how they can be useful in whatever situation they're in, and thinking to themselves, how can I be contributing with my hands and physical effort right now in a useful way? And also paying attention. So if people who get into permaculture, I think the people who like leave our courses and start doing great stuff, it's really not dependent on their experience level or how much education they have in the field and background in it. It's like, how much energy do they have, and how much ability to engage and pay attention and just believe that they can insert themselves in a useful way and then do it. That's really, I mean, it sounds like very like a lot of people would have that, but honestly, it seems like it's surprisingly rare, because what I find is like people really want instructions and they want like prescriptions and detail, like, okay, this is what to do next. And it's like, that's not really how I think it works at all. It's like the people who figure out on their own what to do. Those are, I think, the folks that really really take things and run with it in this kind of field where it's just an open playing field, and there's room for anyone to do all sorts of amazing, creative, useful, beneficial endeavors. But when they're waiting for instructions or someone else to say, hey, do this, they don't seem to really get anywhere on that front. But I think our society has done a great job in the last, especially maybe 25, 30 years, of raising a generation that like needs directions, and
Yeah,
it's really scary in a lot of ways, because I see that every year. We have, I'm a year older, and the apprentices that come in are, let's say, a generalist similar age, and it's different than it was 15 years ago. I think a little bit.
What year were you born?
77.
Okay, I'm 78. I'm reading a book right now called The Fourth Turning. I don't know if you ever come across this book.
I've heard of it.
1997, but it's talking about cycles in time. And it talks about how each generation, these guys who wrote it actually coined the term millennials. But anyway, they're talking about how, like, basically, don't worry, time's not linear like we have come to see it in our culture. And no other culture has really ever looked at it in a linear way like us. And that if it was, it would be scary, because the generations would be getting like worse and worse. But it's like, don't worry, it cycles back around, because the better you do, like if you have a really thriving generation, you can, it's like you can expect the trust fund kid experience to happen, where it's like, really good affluence creates like maybe a lazier generation,
right? Sure,
creates worse times, and then that leads to a generation that's strong again. So
right.
I'm taking some comfort in that, because I know what you mean, and I would imagine you can hunt and forage without having to do. No, it's not totally true. It's a lot of work, but I picture what you're doing being more work. I picture you like day in, day out, all day, constantly having to do something, because it sounds like so much.
It shouldn't sound like so much work, because honestly, it's not. I don't spend that much time doing the kind of reverse wildcrafting kind of thing. Honestly, I should spend more than I do. I really do it as a matter of course in my day-to-day, more than, okay, I'm going to go out and do this. I mean, there are days where I go out, okay, I'm going to take 2 hours and we're going to walk and collect acorns, and we're going to walk up to that log and cut, and we're going to spread them. That's like, a dedicated act. But most of it's just kind of day to day, not every week of the year by any means. I mean, so much of the year, there's not a whole lot to do in the dead of winter sometimes. Sometimes I go out and dedicatedly prune for a couple hours, but half a day max. It's really not a ton. And I feel like you probably have a lot of energy. I feel like what you could do in your own yard and your own immediate zone 1, 2 habitat around you is more than you might think. I think, it for sure. It's really, everything seems daunting, right, when you haven't done it yet, because it's just like you can't picture exactly what's involved. So it seems really daunting. They're like, wait a minute. it's not that hard. It's not that much work, because once you know what's involved, I would really emphasize that it's not nearly as much time and effort and expertise as it may sound like. For sure. You're already doing the bulk of the work, with just going and harvesting wild food. This is not nearly as heavy of a lift as a lot of that, I don't think.
Do you have any go-to resources you recommend for, like, let's say that you are going to be working with a species, you're going to work with black walnut. Do you have resources that you like to go to learn more about the species, or are you like, whatever, I just have a handful of things but do you have specific?
Yeah. Not in particular. Sometimes I'll refer to the cornucopia. What is it? The source book for useful plants. I think it's called cornucopia. That's like a big textbook. But honestly, with I was going to say Google, but I should say DuckDuckGo. With search engines, you can look up species and pull different sources in on whatever species you want to geek out about and get a sense of habitat. Although I look in books less and less, because the more I can interact with the landscape, the more I'm just taking my information from, all right, this is where I see walnuts thrive. And so I don't need to look that up, or especially when you plant stuff and work with a tree you've planted, you really get to know it better than kind of in any way you could read about it. Not that there's always not more useful information you could glean, but not in particular. I mean, when looking at Tree Crops, A Permanent Agriculture by J. Russell Smith, that's always never more than too many arms lengths away. And that's such a more of an inspirational, I think, account than anything, although he does have some specifics in there on maybe it's 10 kind of archetypal trees of the world that we should all be promoting, whichever ones can grow in our areas. I'd say I can't think of any other particular.
Tell everybody a little bit about your book.
Yeah. My book is called The Resilient Farm and Homestead, and I should do a revision one of these years. It's totally ready to have a few things added to it and updated, but it's basically a report 10 years in of our original homestead, and basically lessons learned, what we did, what worked in different ways and how, and what didn't work in certain ways. And it's a whole mess of, there's a big list of 70 some odd principles too that kind of apply anywhere. So it's useful for more than just our climate per se. And there's a bunch of building specific strategies for infrastructure and heating. Gets into a bit of wood heating, which is just a topic that there should be many books on by itself. Wood heating is so massive, and there's just a surprising lack of straight up even books on it. Yeah. So I tried to hit on that a bit, but I could do a whole book on that one day.
Oh, that would be cool, man. I just want to put that in your head. That would be cool. I noticed with hunting, because it was like a patrilineal transmission of information, when you go into the hunting literature, it's basically hunting stories or essays, philosophical essays about hunting. But, when you're like, hey, I'm looking for how to, it's like that what exists is pretty low level junky stuff usually. Yeah. It's just, and I imagine it's similar with the idea of wood heating, because this idea was just passed on. Like, why would you write it down? And then one day you wake up and you need that information. It's not available in the
anyone. I think I couldn't imagine where you could find written down intermediate and advanced wood heating skills. I mean, I'd love a book on that.
Great book title.
It's you'd have to talk to an old timer to get that.
Yeah, right. Cool, man. And for people, so you teach a workshop every year. I know you said you guys had to cancel it this year, but obviously, if everything goes right, you'll be running it next year. So give us a little overview of that, and then I bet you have people coming from everywhere, because I imagine a lot of what you learn applies. But do you have anybody else, cadre, that you kind of recommend to people who are in different parts of the country and world too?
Yeah, for sure. We definitely get people from all over the world, mostly the U.S. and Canada, and then heavily from the Northeast, but little bit of people from all over. And it's a great time. It's a 10-day permaculture course where everyone camps, and we, serve 3 meals a day, and it's like a learning vacation. It's a lot of fun, but it's also pretty jam-packed with
people camp.
People camp, and we have some rooms available too for rent. But it's just a residential workshop, and And then we here and there have done short courses, less lately, just for time considerations. But it's fantastic. Permaculture design course. People leave with a certificate, permaculture design certificate. It fills every year, but I think there might be some spots left. I mean, next year is going to essentially stayed full because most people just moved their registration, but some people had to cancel. So there'll be some spots, I imagine, that did open up again. That's usually in August. And then certainly these permaculture design courses all over the world, and a lot of them are quite academic heavy, and we tend to have a very hands-on one ourselves as much as we can with some required pre-readings that helps us do that. But there's some great ones around the world. California has some good ones. The Bullock brothers have been doing one for a long, long time in the San Juan Islands on Orcas Island in Washington State. And some very established ones in Hawaii and, of course, in Australia and New Zealand, where, the kind of modern permaculture world emerged from. And I think in Europe as well. It's very international. I mean, it's much bigger in some ways in certain parts of the world than it is in the U.S.
It's cool to me to talk about because it's something I have, like I've said, I mean, just tertiary knowledge of, but no real experience. And so but the overlap with what I'm in where my interests are is so strong, and there's so much cross-pollination potential there that it's exciting to talk about it with you. And, I'm curious, any kind of closing messages to foragers, because like I said, there's so many new foragers coming into it. There's so many out there who are like, hey, I'm kind of ready to, I've learned my plant ID. Something Clay was talking about the other day on his episode was just, there's most of the foraging stuff is always like plant ID, plant ID, plant ID.
Right.
It's like, what's after that? And so, what do you tell folks?
No, absolutely. I mean, I think it's really important to just put it out there that that folks should realize that there could be a lot less of the plants and mushrooms and animals you're looking for in the woods and in the wild landscape than you're finding, and there could be a lot more. There could be less, there could be more. And it's up to you. You can have a role in determining that. You could help to denude those populations, or you could help to grow those populations even while you're a harvester. You can help to grow them without just not harvesting. You can harvest and still improve those populations through some of the actions that we've talked about here, and to kind of take on that role as a participant, not just a forager and harvester, but that being a forager means to be a gardener if you're going to be foraging for a long time to come. And I think it was generally looked at that way, that you were tending to what you were foraging. There was reciprocation. It wasn't just a one-way flow. And Tending the Wild is probably the best resource I can think of. That book by M. Ken Anderson to introduce people into the whole concept to begin with, and to what people did in a certain part of the world, and how that relationship can look. And it's really exciting because we can really do good, not just do less bad in our interactions with the landscape.
Right.
And I think as foragers we need to be gardeners. We need to be doing that work of gardening. There's a responsibility there, especially given how many people there are and how denuded natural systems are. It's especially important in today's context to do that. Wilderness wasn't wilderness, as far as I understand. The term wilderness really meant for thousands of years a place that was totally forsaken and hadn't been tended to, and so it wasn't very abundant, and that what was actually really abundant was this large-scale forest garden, so to speak, where people had been there long enough to enrich the populations that we lived on.
Yeah, wow. That's a whole nother topic. Maybe we can talk about it more another time. But it's like that idea, because when you read in old texts mentions of wilderness, it's usually in kind of a negative context.
Sure.
And these are people who are very close to the land. So it's not for the reasons that we'd be afraid of wilderness. It's for very different reasons. And I think a lot of people go, oh, you're a forager. You just like walk out into the woods and survive. It's like, nope, not that well, man. There's not a lot out in the woods. Send me to a river valley maybe, or like in people's backyards where there's all this disturbance and, things like that. But I was thinking to close out, there's so much man, there's a lot of dark news, obviously, and then we all know the state of the oceans and the denuding of the forests and the clear cuts and the nuclear catastrophes. There's just so much going on that's negative, and then we're sort of immersed in that. And then I think now with this idea of food shortages and product shortages and all these kind of things, there's that sense of scarcity too, which is always bad for good decision making. So I'm imagining that you guys are experiencing very normal abundance in your operation out there. And I was wondering if you could just sort of walk us through a little bit of the abundance, because I think it would feel good to know that that's still happening,
Yeah. Well, since when you invest in perennial systems, even without a lot more work each year, you get more and more of, oftentimes of apples and pears and Jerusalem artichokes and blackberries and seaberry and elderberry and black currants and blueberries and all these things that are in the landscape, black walnuts. We haven't put any work into our black walnuts now in probably 6 years, and we only have more black walnuts each year. So the abundance does start compounding. Whereas with a lot of foraging or vegetable growing, unless I put that work in every year, I'm not going to have any vegetables out of the vegetable garden. Right. And so the abundance doesn't kind of accumulate and compound on itself and have a multiplier. But now we're getting to the point where we've just been planting and planting and planting, and now we've been giving away seaberry for the last few years because we just can't harvest it all, and I'm not really interested in trying to sell a lot of it. Same with the black currants and Jerusalem artichokes as well. We keep kind of planting those every year, and now there's just way more than we can eat, and it's pretty achievable within a handful of years to start kind of setting enough living systems in motion that you look back in a little bit and realize, wow, there's way more of this than we can eat. And people realize that who grows zucchini this time of year, right? And everyone's giving their zucchini away on the side of the road. Right. But imagine that effect you see with zucchini with 50 or 100 other species, and some are obviously way more nutrient dense, and not to rip on zucchini, but a lot of more than just mutant squash. And so that does start to be a reality. And what we're really running up against is just people who wants this stuff. Like, we're not around a whole lot of people. We're in a very rural place, and we really just want to see, especially some really special stuff like seaberry and blackcurrant, go to people who can really benefit the most from it. Like maybe people who are, immune compromised or, at a high risk for getting sick, whether it's from, COVID or just whatever normal flu comes around every fall, is a major threat to people. So we're trying to really work on getting a lot as medicine in the hands of people who can need it the most. And the more I grow all this stuff, the less I'm inclined to sell it and turn any of it into money, because it just seems like a really poor trade. It just seems like
bad conversion.
You could give me a ridiculous amount of money for like a half gallon of sea berries, and it still wouldn't feel worth it. Like I don't want the money as much as I want the sea berry. So it starts to make you look at the whole commerce thing a little bit differently, for sure, and just value as a whole.
And then just kind of lastly, what are you excited about personally, in your own projects, and what's on the horizon for you?
Yeah. It's a good, interesting time to ask that question, because I'm really now getting towards 20 years in on kind of really year to year, season to season, focusing on the landscape around me. And a lot of the stuff that was really exciting different times is not, it's all, I'm still interested in all of it, but it doesn't feel like there's constantly all these new frontiers. So I'm trying to just sit back a bit and focus on how to engage others in it and like share the abundance, like I really was saying before. I think that's probably the big frontier, is like we have plenty, and it's like a lot of people don't have plenty. So like that's the limiting factor. How can we get this to our community? Because we can be as set up as anything here, and that doesn't really matter if no one else is. So that's the bottleneck that I think we're trying to rack our brains on and try to take time to connect with the community about. And that's not really our skill set. So we have a lot to learn on that. Like, we didn't get into this for that, but that's what we need to do now. Seed saving on the technical front. I mean, I'm really loving saving a lot of my seed in my garden, the vegetable seed in my garden, and realizing, wow, so much of this stuff I could have been saving for years, and I just didn't think to do it. Like hand pollinating squash this year with varying success, so I can save my squash seed. So that's been a fun. I mean, I've been seed saving for a bunch of years, but trying to this year do a lot more than I have been. Honestly, personally getting quite strong, like doing a bit of like fun, like physical workouts. The whole COVID thing was the COVID thing was a real kick in the ass to like take my health to like try to just be like, look, let's get into another level. Because not that I'm particularly concerned about COVID, but just like, let's make lemonade with all of this fear and turn it into something that's positive. And so I started with in March or April, did a big serious fast, more than I had done. And that just kicked off a nice domino effect of trying to take care of myself better than ever. And so that's been a nice focus. And yeah, just trying to, focus on the family a lot too. And enjoy the limited time we have here, because limited engagement event. There's no guarantees, and just trying to make the most of all this weirdness that's going on in the world of, everything being shut down and people being isolated, and seeing, the beauty that there is in it too. Well, keep doing those workouts and keep eating the sea buckthorn, because we need to keep you around as long as we can. It's cool, just from the outside. I know you're going to want to be modest about it, but it's neat to watch. So it's 20 years, so that's like a mastery path, and you're at this cool stage where it's like, how do I feed this back out to culture? It's just really cool. And yeah, we need you as long as we can have you on the earth, so that you thanks. Thanks a lot. You too. You've inspired a lot of people by reaching people with the different mediums that you have in your practice of being on the landscape. And it's heartening to see there's just more and more people tuning in to, the landscape that we can all be empowered from around us.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where a lot of times, you're ahead of your time, and then you put the work in, and then all of a sudden the events unfold in such a way that you're like, oh, it's really good I did all that before, because now it's needed, So,
Right.
So this is a really interesting moment for folks like you and me who are into these kind of things, because the world's looking for some solutions, So, it's really
I know. Cool. When the whole pandemic thing came down, I remember my dad was like, "You've always been talking about pandemic." I'm like, yeah, I mean, we knew there'd be one. I honestly don't think this is the really bad one that there will be, but for sure, it's like we can expect these things that we don't often like to talk about.
Yeah, this is just a fire drill.
Yeah,
totally. but it's cool because it gives us this opportunity. In a lot of ways, I'm like, oh, good, because now I see where even though I thought about these kind of things for a while, where things are weak for me and where they're strong, and also things that I didn't expect to happen, little black swans. And so, I'm seeing a lot of what we talked about today, especially like I said, around my house being important for me to invest in, so that I'm more relaxed when things like this inevitably happen again in my lifetime. So
totally, there's so much to learn from these events.
Well, Ben, this is awesome. Every time I talk to you, man, such good stuff comes out. So thank you for showing up, and thank you for your generous sharing of your time. And,
sure. Well, thanks for having me on and making a space for it.
Yeah, I'll be looking forward to our next one, man. Thanks for listening to the WildFed podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.